What I want to talk about this morning with you, and probably spend the next half hour focusing on, is workforce. So you'll hear about children and the impact on children throughout the rest of the day. But I want to spend a bit of time talking about workforce. As we know in our schools and in our trusts, it's a really challenging time. And certainly when I've had conversations in different forums I've been in, one of the topics that people keep coming back to is that workforce, that culture, and the change since the pandemic. We are in different times, and we need to move forward in how we respond to that. And that's why I love coming together as a family, because we're very much together in terms of trying to do things differently, trying to address the challenges that are going on. So within my time with you, I want to address what's the context around the workforce nationally at the moment. Secondly, I want to introduce to you a people strategy model. What does it look like? What can it look like moving forward? And then I want to address, just to finish off with you, what are our strategic priorities from this in terms of how we begin to go back and engage with workforce and help workforce to become flourishing or more flourishing. So in terms of, this is the workforce census for 2022. And when you begin to read through it, it doesn't make for very pleasant reading. But again, that's the context that we're living in at the moment. So some of the standout sort of numbers, in terms of people leaving the profession, it was up, so it goes back to 2022, the 2023 census data will come out sometime April, May next year. So it's almost a year behind. But basically in 2021, 8.8% of people left the profession. Huge number. 12.8% of that was obviously those early into their career. One that really surprises me is over a third leave within 6 years. Within 6 years, there's been a lot of time invested into growing those people. People are at their prime, and yet we've got over a third of them beginning to leave the profession. That doesn't help us in terms of putting experienced, high-quality people in front of classes. Just in the middle one at the bottom, 3.2 million days sickness, up from 2 million pre-pandemic, 2019. And on the bottom right, which I find quite an alarming figure, that 67.5% teachers, were absent, and the average for that was 9.3 days. In 2021, it was 47%. So it's still an increasing figure. And yet, we need to deliver consistency for our pupils, our students, and yet we've got figures like that are really not helping us, which creates even more challenge in the system on top of some of the other challenges that we're facing as well. It's worth looking at some of the research that's just been done. So there's a company at the top of the slide called Agirio. They've just released a load of sort of research. They've done research across 175,000 people in the school sector. So it's quite robust data that they've begun to produce. It's worth having a look at it. It goes into sort of reasons behind some of the slides that I've got on the screen there. But what it's basically saying from some of the charts there is that teachers and middle leaders are probably the high risk group for us in terms of potentially resigning from the profession. So when you begin to look at sort of the middle slide, it talks about those people that have never thought about resigning, those that rarely do, and then the bottom of the slide, the middle chart, it begins to talk about those people who are maybe thinking about it more. The line that goes across in one of the charts, sorry, it's on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, the bottom line is senior leaders. So it looks at, as part of the research, it looks at different roles. And senior leaders, as you can see, have jumped in the last year in terms of potentially some of them that might be resigning from the profession. So when we begin to look at some of the narrative around that, there's a challenge for us. And it's heartening to have people in this room that are trying to sort of work in a different way to really sort of counteract some of that. So Ashley mentioned this morning, and Tom's mentioned, what I want to focus on with you about is enabling flourishing adults. And that's the workforce that we obviously are working with in our schools and within our trusts. So this is a complex piece of work, because in our schools, in any organization where it's business as well, people generally come together with different personal, different professional experiences. We're all put together and we're meant to make it work. But we need to make sure that we're flourishing and we're getting human flourishing, not only from our children, but from also our adults. So one thing we spent a bit of time doing before we started producing the people strategy was really beginning to think, what are we trying to design here? What are the sort of key questions that we're needing to think about? So down the left-hand side, we talked about how do we convene people together, both from an individual perspective, but also as a collective. And we know in our schools, trying to get that collective with everybody together is difficult, it's hard. How we can catalyse different programs. So it's helping people to be able to reflect, helping people to be able to engage. But then also making sure that we communicate powerfully, so we become really explicit in terms of what we're actually trying to do and what our vision is and the journey that we're going on together. We talk about coordinating for transformation. We also then talk about this idea of champion accomplishments. And again, certainly in our trust, we've talked much about champion accomplishments, and everybody agrees that's something that should be happening. But people need to make time in their days to make sure that we are championing what other people are doing and recognizing it. So from there, what we then did is begin to produce our people strategy. But before that, we obviously had our vision, and I just wanted to share a bit of work with you on that. So generally in a lot of schools and a lot of trusts that I visit and do work with, you talk about what's the vision, what's the values that go with you. And a lot of people seem to struggle to articulate that. And it's both at probably staff level and student level. And it's about reflecting, why do people struggle to articulate it? Are they words that are just there, or are people actually living them? And this is something that becomes very different in the organisations that we're signed up to in terms of character education and living by our virtues. So something we felt was really important is to sort of build from the bottom up, scaffold it up from the bottom by getting those character virtues absolutely right. And that's been so important for our children, but it's also been important for our staff and right up to governance and board level as well. People need to understand, what are the qualities? What are those virtues that we expect of them? Are they actually living them? Because if we get that right first, there's a greater likelihood they will go on to live the values of our organisations and then begin to understand, to aspire to move towards that actual vision as well. So it's about reflecting, have we got stepping stones in place to help people to really begin to move forward with that? I think also that's really important is, the virtues that we've got are built into the fabric of life at school. So we're seeing in Reading School this morning, the language that's used, how people conduct themselves and how people interact and engage with each other, that is built into the fabric of the school, and you will have it in your schools as well. But those intellectual virtues are so important because they're required for the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. We talk about our moral virtues, those which help us to respond well to different situations. Our civic virtues, which are necessary to engage as responsible citizens. And our performance virtues, which crucially influence our behavioural skills and our psychological capacities to enable us to put the other virtues into place. And when you begin to see those getting lived and they become a part of the fabric of your school, whether they're in lessons or within the playground, you've got transformation, collective transformation beginning to take place. Something we do with all our pupils is we have an Inspiring Changemaker programme. And the target is, every year, 100% of our pupils across all our schools will achieve the awards that go with that. So they learn to be about inspiring researchers, inspiring speakers, inspiring volunteers, inspiring adventurers. And with that, they're actually living out the virtues. So it goes back to this idea of building from the bottom up. They begin to understand the importance of the fabric of virtues being part of everyday life for them. So we then moved forward in terms of beginning to create our people strategy and came out with 3 sections for it. So it's an inspiring family to join, an inspiring family to work in, an inspiring family to grow in as well. So I just want to spend a bit of time sort of going through each of those sections with you. So obviously you'll be able to see our people strategy through there. But again, coming back to the why people strategy. Our schools can't just be places of human flourishing for children. They need to be flourishing places for our staff as well. As Lynn Swainer and Andy Wolfe from the Church of England wrote, where there are a few flourishing adults, there will be a few flourishing children. So we need to care deeply about our workforce and give renewed consideration to what good work means and how we might strengthen our understanding of what it means to be a good employer and indeed a good leader and a good colleague. This is a phrase that we sort of used in launching our people strategy that seems to have resonated with the workforce. And this talks about this idea of flourishing adults. You will have many flourishing adults in your schools, but it's about how we keep moving to that 100% of flourishing adults. So we know from the flourishing adults that exist in our schools already, they are effective. But collectively, if we have everybody moving towards being a flourishing adult, we will create transformation on the scale that we need to within these challenging times. So let me turn to the first part of our people strategy, and it talks about being an inspiring family to join. So we spent quite a time reflecting on recruitment. You know, what is it? Are we actually using character to recruit people into our trust? And as the Jubilee Centre have done, there's been 4 videos that you might have sort of had sight of already. It's worth having a look at these if you haven't seen them. It goes around different regional character hubs, looking at different recruitment ideas in terms of how we're looking to bring people into the profession, but at the same time, what would the interview process look like? What does the follow-up after that begin to look like as well? So I thought I'd just share a minute with you just to give you a flavour of what this begins to look like.
Through the interview process, we have lots of layers. We have lots of elements and opportunities for the candidate to engage with existing staff and colleagues at the Trust. We encourage them to speak and meet with the children. The children like to ask them questions as well and find out about them. We like to offer them more formal sides of the interview where we ask them specific questions about their career and their opportunities so far. We also really heavily give them a space for self-reflection. So when they come to the interview, we'll ask them to prepare their own character profile so they've had time to reflect.
Most schools, and certainly the schools that I have visited, they take the whole interview process for new candidates applying to the school very seriously indeed. And actually the best schools make sure that that person is there all day, because it's important that the individual is able to discern the character culture of the school, and they've got to decide whether they're going to be happy there. So they need to have lots of opportunities for that.
We're not after perfect robots. We want individuals, we want people with character, people of substance, and we want to try and really get evidence of what they're like, what their personality is like, what they're really like, not an act you put on for an interview.
We ensure candidates have a range of opportunities to be able to demonstrate their own character throughout the interview process. Now the process really depends on the role. So for potential teachers, we will always do a lesson observation.
If we have a wide field, then we might be a bit courageous in the type of lesson that we ask them to teach and ask them to focus on. For example, in English, find a poem that would help you to talk about empathy. Or if it's in chemistry, can you teach a lesson that elicits an understanding of critical thinking?
The lesson observation is crucial because that's where I would be looking for virtues in practice. So are potential candidates kind? Are they compassionate? I look at how they speak and act and how they listen to children. Are they aware of the needs of all pupils so that their practice is inclusive with a very caring, nurturing approach?
In terms of the interview stage itself, we give the questions to the candidates before the interview. It gives them a chance to go away and reflect and come back with some really strong answers. And what we found with that is much richer discussions and interview process.
The formal interview always starts with a question, why do you want to work in a school of character? So we hope that elicits their understanding of the school, our philosophy, our links to the Jubilee Centre, the framework that we follow.
During the interview, I'm looking for an element of confidence, I'm looking for passion and enthusiasm, I'm looking for them to be humble.
Question 2 of our interviews is always around character. And it'll depend on the role what the question is. And so, for example, if it's a teacher, you're going to be in the classroom 90% of the time teaching. How are you going to develop young people's character in that role? Whereas if it's a middle leader or senior leader, I might say, okay, is developing character or strong outcomes more important? Which is, and discuss with me. It's more about them as a person than the actual pedagogy, because the pedagogy is something we can teach quite quickly when they come on board.
As part of our interview process, we have designed and sent out to potential candidates a recruitment package. Within that, we ask our candidates to come to interview with a pre-prepared character profile. This is a brilliant way of having individuals reflect on the journey so far, reflect on themselves. They've brought things like photos, annotations, memories, stories, and all of that has provided a really rich beginning for our conversation.
Our students are our best ambassadors, but they are also our biggest critics. They know what they're looking for. They know what the qualities of a good teacher are. They know what they want from a professional.
Part of the interview process is meeting with the children, so we have the school council in each of the schools. They sit with the candidate and ask questions, and they also give feedback. And one of the questions, which I would hate to answer actually, is tell us a good joke. But it's about seeing whether the person can interact with the children, whether they've got humility, humour, etc.
They will have questions that are specifically about how that individual is going to bring their understanding and knowledge of character and values to their school. And what children tend to do is to ask for specific examples that are likely to be pertinent to them. And that's very, very useful.
I think it's really important to not only see a person within a formal setting, a formal interview, it's also about getting under the skin and understanding the motives of why somebody's applied for a position, but also how they interact in the day-to-day running of the school. How do they queue up in the dinner hall with the children to get their dinner? How do they interact with the people in the office? How do they interact with the members of staff as they're walking through the corridors?
This one candidate took a genuine interest in one of our members of staff who was making the teas and coffees. And actually that was really important. That showed that they were a team player, that they were interested in other people, that they showed empathy.
In order for a person to be the natural self, you want to strip away as much of the stress as possible. That's why we give them the interview questions in advance. That's why we book them a parking space and put a sign up so they don't need to worry about that. Because when you're not stressing about things as much, then you're more likely to relax and show your natural self.
All of those pieces of the jigsaw will come together, give us a big picture of the candidate at the end of the day, and hopefully enable us to make some decisions about who would be a really good fit for a school where character is at the heart of what we do.
So as I said, there's 4 different videos that look at recruiting for character. Well worth a link. They're obviously on the Jubilee website, but we'll just begins to share some of the different ideas around it. Certainly from an outcome point of view, we've had recently we had 2 vacancies, teaching posts, and where we are in North Devon is actually really hard to recruit to. But we managed to recruit 27 candidates for one post and 15 for another. And it's not just the number that I was really surprised at. When I went through the applications as well, the quality of the applications was really fabulous. And when we invited people to interview, the panel on the formal part introduced themselves and their character and how we've arrived at this point. And it takes away the pressure from the candidate of we're there and we're suddenly on to you. But then they have to introduce themselves and share a character profile for 10 minutes of themselves. And it's amazing what comes out of that. I've never really been in so many interviews where there's been tears and real emotion and listening to people's stories. But as Ashley talked about earlier as well, really understanding the story of that person and the journey they've been and how they've arrived at this place. And in the feedback they gave to us, they've never been through a process like it. They've never had to do something professionally like that before. and they'd never really reflected personally, was the feedback we got. So I think it's an incredibly interesting process, but it really begins to open up the interview and take an interview into a different scale about how we can actually engage with them. The second part, I just want to spend a bit of time looking with you. It's about an inspiring family to begin to work within. And this, again, is about the workforce. So Lindsay, who's our character lead in the Alumnus Trust, she really sent us away with a brief in terms of how could we actually sort of begin to, what would this begin to look like in a model? And she came back with this model. And so around the centre, we've got this idea of, you know, the civic, moral, intellectual and performance virtues. But then what we've also then got is this idea of, you know, some of the wider aspects around workforce, this idea of belonging, believing, you know, feeling part of that community, feeling purpose, feeling meaning, and so on. And what we've worked out is people actually flux between the two, because people are all different, and how they get to human flourishing and that characterful culture will vary for all of them. So that's something that we've put together, and we've actually then started obviously putting other things around it. So we did a consultation which goes back to one of the previous slides, which talks about the intentional design. So we spent quite a bit of time going out and actually talking to staff, presenting to staff, putting drafts together of what people's strategy would begin to look like with the 3 different sections. And again, that listening exercise was actually hugely important. This was about the workforce, so we really needed to hear about what the workforce wanted. And they actually took the process incredibly seriously, and there was actually, it moved away from what we thought the regular discussion around the challenges in the job might be to actually more of a higher level strategy discussion. So we did that, and then we began to move into sort of looking at different opportunities. And one of the things we did first with them after launching it, and you know, we actually did a proper official launch with the whole staff, you know, from teachers through to caretakers through to everybody in the trust. And I think that was hugely important that everybody came together. And it goes back to that statement about flourishing adults being individually effective, but collectively we will be transformative. And that seems to have really stuck from the launch with people, and people still talk about that phrase as if it's something that, you know, we're all working towards trying to achieve. One of the things we then did with all the staff was ask them to complete a survey. So VIA is, you can obviously Google that. It's got a really lovely survey for everybody to begin to access. I got a group of staff before we launched it out to staff to pilot it, just sort of managing the risks around things going wrong around it. And people came back. What I noticed almost straight away, once people had done the survey, people wanted to talk about it. People wanted to engage, and actually the conversation very much became about character strengths. So it identifies people's sort of rank order of 24 strengths. And it really began to change the conversation, individually how people engage, but collectively people wanted to start coming together to really begin to support each other. What also happened from there is on the right-hand side, you will see an accomplishment card. We actually just put these out into schools and said, we need to start recognizing accomplishments. There is great stuff happening in our schools every day, but so many of it isn't recognized. So every school has got an accomplishment board. There's a stack of cards beside it, and people can just quickly write sort of, you know, 5 or 10 words, whatever, just about recognizing what's going on or somebody that they've recognized. It means a huge amount to people. Again, you know, people get quite emotional, knowing that people have recognized what they've actually done within their daily job. Through VIA as well, it's not just about the survey. What that website also does, it keeps in touch with every single member of staff in the trust. So every week it drops into people's inboxes based on what their character strengths are, different ideas that they can actually practice character with. And at the beginning of every month, there is a calendar that comes out, as you can see in the bottom left. So I just got the November calendar through just a couple of days ago, and I find it really engaging and really inspiring because it makes me stop and makes me think. So in the November calendar, some of the ideas it talks about reflect on what is good. Just take that time to think what is good about what we're actually doing together. Reframe a difficult situation. Again, it's just allowing people to pause and reflect. Enhance hope and combat burnout. So you can click on all these different links with these ideas, and it gives ideas for staff in terms of how to go about beginning to act upon these. Write a letter to somebody sharing gratefulness. We recognise, and I'm seeing people nodding back at me, it's the simple things, but it's about recognising, helping people to reflect, not only for themselves, but how they begin to impact on other people around them as well. What we've also then taken as part of our characterful culture is we've taken this work on character strengths and actually built it into our appraisal process. And again, this is the first year that we've actually done this. And I've got leaders who are reporting back to me. Again, they've had incredibly emotional conversations because the first part of the discussion is people have done the survey, they bring some character strengths they want to discuss as part of their appraisal. And again, people learn things, they take the time to learn things about their workforce they didn't actually know. And some of the pressures that they also have, and how that we now know about some of these pressures, how we begin to respond in a different way. That helps that person in terms of feeling belonging to the organisation, but because the organisation cares about them, we get a greater productivity from them as well. So in the appraisal process, and I know I'm limited for time, so I won't be able to go through all of this. The first section is really about helping them to discuss what their character strengths are and how they're going to move that forward during the next 12 months. The second part of the appraisal interview is beginning to look at, with the character strengths you've got, how are you going to use them to support collective transformation across your school or across the trust? So it's actually pinning down with them. The first part is about you. The second part is about this collective. How are you going to contribute to the organisation? And then the third part is about using those first two parts to then begin to, how's that going to support you in your daily job and some of the other objectives around classrooms and so on that you need to move forward as well. Having been in education for many years and gone through many appraisal processes, this has been a real transformation in terms of the dialogue with staff, because they now feel they own the appraisal process, and it's not somebody doing to them. They feel they've got real control of it, but they feel they've got a buy-in to where they're trying to take it as well. Something else we've introduced as well is something around 5 qualities of leadership. So we all know, sitting in this room, you know, there are many articles, books being written on leadership. But what came back from the staff was about, you know, how do we have conversations? And it seems incredible as professionals that we still struggle. Some people in our organisation struggle to have conversations with each other. So basically, somebody mentioned this morning about being an architect. So these frames discussions and meetings. One school just told me the other day when they had the staff meeting, they put a laminated card with the qualities of leadership on the table for everybody to see. And then it keeps everybody sort of geared around a focused conversation. So it's this idea of being the thoughtful architect. If we're going to do something, who's architecting it? Crucially, are we connecting it up? And then are we going away and tenaciously implementing it together? So it helps keep things very, very focused. The one that has become quite a common phrase is the one on the left-hand side, which talks about being an edgy catalyzer. And a lot of people have identified when we did training with all the staff around this, a lot of them struggle to have an edgy conversation with somebody. So instead of having that 5-minute conversation, which doesn't have to be a horrible conversation, we've got an issue, let's unpick it in a characterful way so we find a solution. But people, when we did the training, sort of talked about, you know, they had a frustration with something, they didn't say anything for 2 weeks, it began to grate on them. After 3 weeks, it became really frustrating for them. And after 6 weeks, they actually became pretty angry. If they'd had the 5-minute conversation, it would have helped. And we wouldn't have gone through that process and pain that people have to go through. And it's lovely, because when I go into schools in the role I perform, I have staff coming up saying, can I have an edgy conversation with you? Absolutely. You know, let's find a solution together. And that's that openness that begins to really happen from there. Something else that we've also done in terms of, these aren't really, we put out, well, Lindsay puts this out every week. It's this idea of, practicing a characterful culture. And I think, it's the language is so important in this. So it's about practicing. So the real feel when we're working with the workforce mustn't be about we're directing them or telling them what to do. So the language becomes really important around this. So Lindsay puts this out just as a top up, a thought for the week, whatever, on top of the VIA stuff they do as well. And it just really sort of hits on a sort of few points for them to begin to reflect on, that they might want to sort of discuss with other people during the week, or things they actually want to move forward together. So again, that's just been really important, and it helps us just reinforce messages. So on the bottom right, it talks about recognising team accomplishments. So we've talked about recognising individual people previously. So it's this prompting people, do you want to recognise team accomplishments? So it puts that in people's minds about how we're actually going to do that. So that was probably phase one for us. And what we were trying to achieve in phase one with our people strategy is engagement. That everybody was engaged. And I'm just waiting for some data to come back around this year around that. But we're looking for 100%, no matter what role you perform across the schools. Everybody's engaging with this. And everybody would have been through an appraisal process. So we know they should have engaged with the survey, which should have then led on to other bits and pieces. But are they actually using the accomplishment cards? Are they actually using some of that language around leadership? And it's about everybody being that leader. And so I'm just waiting for some information to come around on that, because once we get that full engagement, we then move on to, around that model, there's the different ideas around belonging, around meaning, around purpose, and really begin to move that forward. What I've written down at the bottom here is a phrase that I think that's really, really important. We spend so much time thinking about the children in our schools, and quite rightly so. But we've got to think about our adults, and I think Ashley talked about, and Tom mentioned as well this morning, this idea, if we have flourishing adults, they're going to be performing at a much better level. And if we have flourishing adults, they're going to empower flourishing children, which are going to enable flourishing schools. It's a really simple concept, but it's one that we probably don't spend enough time really sort of paying attention to the starting point of it in terms of our flourishing adults. So, in terms of belonging, that's become a huge aspect for us. And I just want to read a quote from Owen Eastwood, who shared a compelling view around what belonging actually means, both in the past, the present, and future in terms of our actions. And what he goes on to say is, belonging is a wildly undervalued condition required for human performance. When our need to belong in a team is met, our energy and focus pour into the team's shared mission. And I think that's a hugely powerful quote, something we probably know, and we've all been part of at some points in our careers and our personal lives. But we probably need to step back and really think, is that happening for everybody? Are we engaging everybody to feel like that? A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Confederation of Schools Trust Conference, which obviously is there for all the trusts around the country, and their theme for the conference was around belonging. So this word belonging seems to be becoming much more prevalent in terms of the work we're doing. And Leora Crudis, talked about, around belonging, there's three parts to it. There's the people, there's the purpose, and the place. And that's a piece of work that, we're evolving at the moment. In terms of our people, that real sense of belonging and that relationship within the organisation as well, but across into families and into the communities. Our purpose is how we're interconnected and having the capacity to link with other people and share what we have with them. And one of the things we've done through what you'll see as a professional learning pathways that we've introduced across the Trust is in every school, people sign up to different professional pathways. It brings people together from different schools. It then allows people to build their own networks beyond their own settings. And people in that one setting can become quite isolated within that culture. But by being able to access and engage with the network outside of your own organisation, it brings a healthy perspective in terms of there are other ways of looking at things. But by working with the people outside of your organisation as well, it helps in terms of characterful culture, in terms of what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're engaging with the survey, how they're engaging with different elements to build characterful culture as well. Crucially, in terms of place, as we talked about, we know the challenges in our schools around the place. But it's fundamental in our identity. So when we talk to people in our schools, parents, people who live in the community, that their identity is built around the communities that they live in. And we know schools are anchor institutions within those communities. And it's absolutely essential that we, within our work, by building flourishing adults, take that out into our communities to both strengthen the education perspective and, so parents and communities really begin to champion education and allow that to really begin to flourish. And I think post-pandemic, there's been a real change in terms of communities, in terms of how they champion education, and it's a piece of work that we really need to work with our communities on. I just want to spend a bit of time looking at strategic priorities. So this was another survey that came from the National Schools Trust 2023. So this is really recent. And we know in our schools, we talk about, what are our priorities for this year and where's the plan? And we've got our plan in terms of what we're trying to do. And I go to many, many meetings at the moment, and people talk to me about workforce, big, big priority. When you begin to look at that survey, fourth down, we've got workforce and people strategy. Fifth one down, building a strong organisational culture. It's still dropping down the list, and yet people talk about this is hugely important. I'm not saying for 1 minute it needs to sit at number one and be the only thing we do, but it needs to sit alongside those top priorities, because if we don't move flourishing adults forward, we're not going to really get the best from our pupils in terms of really empowering them to becoming flourishing children, which enables flourishing schools. So it's a piece of work about how we sort of blend this in, and it works alongside everything else we do. But I think we're at a point in time that's absolutely crucial within the education landscape. And you go back to the context I shared with you in terms of some of the numbers. This is a time where we've really got to start paying attention to workforce and culture, and really beginning to think about how we get flourishing adults together. And this is from the Jubilee Centre, bringing character to life. And it talks where schools and workplaces promote positive cultures of character and virtue, so other outcomes are positively affected. And all of us in this room can probably pay testament to that. These outcomes include higher performance levels among staff, greater sense of professional purpose, good citizenship, greater staff commitment, and feelings of well-being. Again, it's a lovely outcome to work towards, but behind that statement, there is obviously the work that's around the workforce that needs to take place to get us there. So just to finish, in terms of where we are now and the challenges that face us, I hope from today you take away really explicit messages that need to be very clear and acted upon in schools about how we begin to open discussions, how we engage people about really begin to moving some of the workforce issues together. I've shared with you this idea about the flourishing adults in our schools. Will empower flourishing children and enable flourishing schools. There's another line that goes with it, which is this as well, which we all know the pressures around this in our schools, is about how do we get flourishing parents? It's not a piece of work that we've gone into at the moment, but it's in our thinking. So if we talk about flourishing adults in our workforce, and I'm seeing so many people nodding at the moment, we've got to start working about post-pandemic, that social contract with our parents. How do we reignite it? How do we get them to become the champions of that anchor institution of that school within their community? A huge piece of work, but probably, there's a lot of listening that needs to happen to those communities. Some of it will probably be very difficult for us to listen to, but it will be a way forward. I hope you've enjoyed, and hopefully that's been useful for you. Thank you.